The single most influential person in the development of Icke's current ideas is a man named Brian Desbrow. Desbrow wrote a lot of conspiracy articles and posted them on the internet in the mid-90s into the 2000s. Later, these articles would be compiled into a book. Desbrow is behind an astonishing amount of Icke's research. There's a lot of interesting things about Mr. Desbrow. First of all, despite the fact that his bio says that he served as a director of research and development for several American high-technology companies and has provided consultation to a company involved in deep space research, there's no record of him doing anything like this on the internet. Which seems odd, since you would think that if a person who was publishing material on the internet so early in its history, that he would also leave some trail to his apparently earth-changing scientific research. Another interesting thing is that despite the fact that Icke, when referring to Desbrow, calls him his American scientist friend, you can read Desbrow's own bio to find out that his information was given to him by spiritual beings, like Icke. Desbrow says, during an out-of-body experience which occurred in 1971, he encountered 5 highly spiritually evolved, non-physical beings who informed him that he must write a revisionist history of the world. The purpose of the book was to take the readers out of their comfort zones by presenting them with truth regarding such diverse subjects like the true location of Atlantis, the duplicitous acts of the Illuminati, and the fundamentals of free energy technology. It was not until later that the author learned that the non-physical entities that he had encountered were associated with a non-physical directorate who were the overlords of a group of terrestrial mystics known through the centuries as the Quadragon. It is the role of the Quadragon to intercede in the political affairs of the world periodically in an attempt to elevate the level of human spirituality. It's interesting that, like David, Desbrow also speaks out very harshly against Alice Bailey and the Ascended Masters in his book. He even says, the Lucis Trust is a major New Age command center on behalf of the Illuminati, and her book, Education in the New Age, outlined a social engineering program which later was adopted by the Club of Rome. In it she wrote, the science of eugenics will grow. Desbrow also writes, Ascended Masters were in actuality merely nicknames she had assigned to the wealthy Masonic patrons of the Theosophical Society, and displayed outrage against phony psychics claiming to channel these non-existent beings. But in an equally amazing feat of doublethink, Desbrow believes the exact thing that Alice Bailey believes. That is, that the non-physical directorate, or ascended spiritual beings, are intervening in the political affairs of the world in an attempt to elevate the level of human spirituality, which is arguably the main point to theosophy, as well as all the stuff about the Aryans, which we will see later. As far as Desbrow's scientific background, according to his bio, it seems to be limited to a story he tells where a chance encounter with a pediatrician who had been one of Wilhelm Reich's research associates gave him access to all of his notes, which he says enabled him to acquire a knowledge of weather engineering and orgonautic science. In addition, as luck would have it, a similar thing happened to him, but this time it was with Nikola Tesla's notes. He says he met an old lady at a spiritual healing circle who had asked him if he liked Nikola Tesla. She apparently then told him a story that he writes on his website. It says, quote, one day, continued the lady, Tesla felt a tug on his coat sleeve. Looking down, he saw the landlord's 12-year-old son, who said, Mr. Tesla, will you teach me all that you know? Tesla was so impressed that the boy became one of Tesla's enthusiastic protégés, and later married the lady the author had just met. The lady then provided the author with some of her late husband's research notes on free energy and anti-gravitic technology. In this manner, many doors were opened, thus enabling the author to acquire meaningful data for his 2 books. The strangest part about Desbrow's bio, in my opinion, is that he claims to be an expert at deprogramming mind control victims. He claims that he does this in order to get information out of them to help his research into the New World Order. He has written quite a lot about trauma-based mind control, and at that time, very little was known on the internet about it. And it does appear he knows quite a lot about how to program multiples. This will become very interesting as we continue this investigation. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at how David Icke was influenced by Brian Desbrow. Icke's book, The Biggest Secret, is the first time that I know of that Icke mentions Desbrow in print. He dedicated that particular book to him, and he cites him profusely throughout the book as his source for things like Martians coming to Earth and founding the Aryan race, which the reptilians used to overtake the planet. Brian is also the source for much of the information on the Babylonian world, and things like black people are a result of the Earth being closer to the sun at one point, the Ice Age being an illusion, monoatomic gold, directed energy weapons, UFOs are government craft, crop circles are space beams, David's new view on Jesus, and much more. Ivan Fraser, the other person who David dedicated his book The Biggest Secret to, later spoke out against David and said this about Brian Desbrow, quote, "Is there anything David could tell us about Brian Desbrow's background to allay any doubts we may have about his integrity, considering his massive influence in the content and direction of The Biggest Secret?" Also, Icke's subsequent book called Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center Disaster is no better than a copy and pasting of Brian Desbrow's article entitled The 9/11 Disaster, The Myth and Reality. If you have read Icke's Alice in Wonderland book on 9/11, please read Desbrow's article when you have time, and you will see that the information in there is exactly the same. The wording, even the mistakes. But the curious thing is that even though it's clear from reading Desbrow's 9/11 article that Desbrow is the one who did all the research, Icke doesn't cite Desbrow one time in his book, even though it's painfully obvious that it was taken from him. I think that Desbrow was quite content to feed information to Icke, even if he got no credit. One example of this is in regard to the reptilian scandal. As I mentioned, The Biggest Secret is dedicated to Brian Desbrow and another man named Ivan Fraser. According to Fraser, it was Desbrow that introduced Icke to Arizona Wilder, and it was her testimony that ended up being the reason why Icke went public with the reptilians thing. Desbrow also admits to introducing Icke to Arizona Wilder, as well as arranging the meeting between the two, because Wilder was a victim of trauma-based mind control, and apparently Desbrow had accessed her programming in order to get information about the Illuminati. According to him, he was amazed to find that she confirmed what he had already been telling Icke, which will be important later. This is Ivan Fraser's side of the story. He had been proofreading The Biggest Secret for David Icke, and he found out about the reptilians thing this way. He says, quote, "Arizona Wilder was not mentioned at all in the draft copy of The Biggest Secret, which I had read. David had not met her yet. When the book was released, people started ringing me with questions like, 'Is it true about the reptiles?' and 'Is this stuff about the royal family true?' At which time I replied that I thought it was, based on the fact that the version that I had read stated only the theory of reptilians and that certain of the royals were involved in satanic rituals. Soon I heard about Arizona Wilder. David stated that he saw his encounter with Arizona Wilder as an amazing synchronicity which endorsed his work in his latest book. How could she have known all this stuff which tallied so exactly with The Biggest Secret? Well, I believe I'm not as naive as David, and I know exactly how she could have known. Icke was passing copies of the book via post to me and others for editing. Fraser continues, "This brings in another character who is pivotal to the entire Biggest Secret thesis. It was a contact of David's named Brian Desbrow, who introduced Arizona to David. Brian is mentioned as a source for a great deal of the information in the book, having supplied most of the material on which David based his idea about the Martians coming to Earth and founding the Aryan race, which the reptilians used as a vehicle to overtake the planet. Brian is also the source for much of the information David had compiled on the Babylonian world, its myths, and how they fed into the sinister secret societies. It was Brian Desbrow who was also looking at the draft copy of The Biggest Secret at the same time as myself, i.e. before David met Arizona Wilder. Therefore, the fact that Brian Desbrow may be responsible for fundamentally leading the direction of David's research, if not planting much of the basis of the book in David's mind, is obvious. But then, to be the same person responsible for giving him the so-called eyewitness to testify to the verity of that information is highly suspicious. Brian also writes articles on mind control and seems very knowledgeable on the subject. Is it possible that he could be directly involved in some way that we are not being told about? Fraser also says that Arizona endorsed Desbrow's theories so closely that, quote, "You would almost think she had already read the book or had been given the information beforehand." He continues, "Or considering that she claims to be an ex-mind-controlled slave, could it be that she was pre-programmed? Testimony from Mark Phillips and Kathy O'Brien as to how arduous it is to deprogram a CIA slave makes me very suspicious that Arizona Wilder could be considered reliable. She claims that since her programmer died, the programming broke down. I don't believe this can be accepted as such. and external experts would have to be brought in to convince me that if she was controlled to the highest level, that she could be so deprogrammed now to be considered reliable. Brian Desbrow describes the story in this way. My own research, based on unpublished astrophysical data, revealed that Mars originally occupied our planet's orbit and was populated by a technologically advanced Aryan race. A celestial catastrophe displaced Mars into its present orbit, forcing the Aryan survivors to colonize our planet and subsequently construct the Great Pyramid. Then they were overthrown by an evil priesthood who established the royal court of the dragon in Egypt. While David was writing his book, it was my good fortune to meet the mother goddess of the Illuminati. She corroborated my research, adding that the Illuminati hierarchy are shape-shifting dragons who require the consumption of Aryan blood in order to maintain their shape-shifting capability, hence their opposition to interracial marriages. As we watch these clips of Arizona Wilder, notice that when she was asked about the history of the reptilians, that she says that she was made to learn this. No matter who she thinks taught her this information, the fact that a bunch of Satanists made someone learn something sounds like programming to me.
From your experience being brought up in this Illuminati environment, were you ever told anything about where these reptilians came from and what is the history of it all?
I was made to learn through Mothers of Darkness, which is a certain aspect of the organization, because that was an early part of my training, the history of what was the Illuminati on this planet. And what I learned was that the Aryans originally were from Mars, and the reptilians came to that planet they came from another place. They came to that planet. They came to rule because they wanted to mix, so they said, with that race, and but they became the overlords.
That's an interesting term, overlords. Brian Desbrow uses it almost 30 times in his book, compared to Icke using it one time, and even that was in a quote. It doesn't prove that the info was planted by Desbrow, but it is a suspicious coincidence.
And the Martians, or Aryans, were seeking to escape from it. They went to the moon, and then were there attacked, and they then went to Earth and established culture here on Earth approximately 6,000 years ago. And at that point in time, they were doing well, and they were mixing with the indigenous population of this earth. They were getting along with. And then about 4,000 years ago, the reptilians arrived here and again began to take over. And they instilled themselves in different places underground in the earth, and also this one part of them, the ruling part, took over and became involved in the politics and in the religion, and started controlling through these means at that point in time.
A woman named Sva Lee, who is widely regarded as trustworthy by many in the truth movement of all backgrounds, claims to be a former programmer for the Illuminati. She is currently in hiding, we hope, but her writings, which are still posted on the internet, fill in many of the details about how mind control slaves are programmed. One time she was asked about this reptilian idea. The question is, Sva Lee, I have to ask you this. There are stories floating around on the internet about the Illuminati and other agencies being run by extraterrestrials, in particular a reptilian race operating from a higher dimension. Any thoughts on that? My answer will probably cause a lot of anger, and it's not meant to step on any toes. Here it goes. I have never seen an alien or extraterrestrial. I have seen some programming to make people think they saw aliens as a cover story for programming, if they remembered. None of the head trainers I knew or others on the leadership council believed in aliens, although I never asked them. I personally believe that the reptilian stuff is actually the demonic at work. I have seen shape-shifting and other stuff because of demonic influence. Okay, so some of you here will say, gee, she believes in demons. That's as far out as aliens. Well, this is what the Illuminati certainly believe in. They know there are spiritual realities, and they think that they can control them. Those of a more cynical bent would say that the shape-shifting was a drug-induced hallucination and group hysteria in the context of a ritual setting. I will let each reader decide based on their personal comfort zone, but no, absolutely no reptiles or aliens seen in Washington, D.C. or San Diego, California as of 5 years ago. At least I never saw them. Interesting that Icke seems to validate this idea that spirits can make a person shapeshift.
It was a lady who channeled this consciousness back in 1990. And I'll just read what it said because it's so relevant to now with the hindsight of the years that have passed. And if anyone doesn't, believe in shapeshifting, they should have seen this woman's face when she was doing this, because she became someone else. Her face, it was like, whoa, changed to a completely different face.
I would say that Arizona Wilder's testimony is worth listening to. It seems to be consistent with high-level satanic rituals. I would suggest one possibility is that she may have been made to learn the reptilian story, as Spally suggested, so that if her programming did ever begin to break down, she would tell people that it was reptilians instead of satanic rituals. Something that a lot of people miss about her testimony is that the entire purpose for the ritual she did was to summon what she calls demons, or old ones, so that they could give more information about how the New World Order should be set up to the top-level people. It's clear that she believes it's the demons, not reptilians, that are behind the planning for the New World Order.
They materialize from out of another dimension and are present at rituals, and they are so powerful, and their presence is such an evilness about them, and they want out of this other dimension, and they have to be called out by someone who has that power, and the reptilians don't have this power. That's very important, that they don't have this power. So during a ritual, these old ones are called out, and they are what Christianity would have called the demons, and they want out. They're always demanding to be let out, and so you have to be very powerful to keep them in line and to make them go back when it is time for them to go back.
Why do the reptilians want to manifest these quote, demons at the rituals?
It brings power to the rituals. It brings power to them. They are told things by these entities, and they are encouraged to go on with what they're doing, and knowledge is imparted to them through these entities.
If this is the case, why is there no attempt to see what we can learn about them? Why all this focus on reptilians and Mars and Aryans? By her own admission, they aren't calling the shots. The spirits behind them are. I want to mention a few more things about the reptilian issue before moving on. She states that the reptilians change back to reptilians when asleep. Considering how many of them were educated in schools, where they also lived amongst hundreds of others in dorms, and many of them are in the armed forces, you would think that someone would have noticed this happening by now. Hey buddy, you don't look so good when you fall asleep. She states that the royal reptilians can't stay in human form at the scent of blood, and transform and go crazy, ripping into their victims. And in all those years, nobody has ever noticed this when they cut themselves, been around blood, menstruating women, etc. Considering they are so public, there is no way that they have never been in the vicinity of blood. The other testimony that Icke uses to confirm the reptilian issue is that of Credo Mutwa. This is what Ivan Fraser said about Mutwa. Quote, soon after this, the Arizona Wilder interview, David re-emerged from a trip to Africa, announcing a new video called The Reptilian Agenda, which is an interview with a Zulu shaman called Credo Mutwa, who is confirming the evidence of shape-shifting reptilians. Credo recounts various ancient Zulu myths about the reptilian race which manipulates mankind, which are taken literally by himself and Icke, and seen as a remarkable confirmation of the reptile-human race theory, although Credo's version is that the race actually originated on Earth, left it, and returned. Furthermore, the central reptile Aryan race thesis is fundamentally challenged by Moutoi's assertion that the black leaders of his country and their bloodlines are from the reptilian race also. Moutois also speaks about personal encounters with gray aliens, which he states are servants of the reptilians. Moutois elsewhere, rather contradictorily, states that the grays are actually the reptilians with an artificial skin. This contradiction is not challenged by Icke. I also agree with Fraser when he says that both Moutois and Arizona Wilder may be consciously very genuine in recounting their experiences according to their memories, but I believe we need to be extremely careful before buying into what amounts to circumstantial stories with no proof. Also, I want to address this idea that's circulating on YouTube and other video sites, that people's pupils change and you can tell that they are reptilians this way. This is an effect caused by uploading a video with bad resolution. The same effect is happening with other elements in the picture, but you only notice it on the eyes because the eyes are very detailed things, and when the pixels cut out on them, it's more noticeable than it is with the other elements in the picture. Even Icke doesn't believe this stuff.
All over the internet, people started talking about this now, and these pictures are circulating. This might be probably is just a trick of the light, but it's very symbolic of what we're looking at.
Desborough gave Icke another view that became very important to Icke's teaching. He gave him his current view on Jesus. Most of you might not know, but Icke's view about Jesus changes dramatically from book to book. For instance, the early Icke is very confident that Jesus existed, only that the Bible didn't include parts of his story that it should have.
There is a thin line of truth in the Bible, certainly, and many of the things that the being Jesus, who certainly did exist and certainly did die in that way, says are accurate reflections of what he said, but they are taken out of context and misinterpreted.
One interesting way to demonstrate that his views changed dramatically about this from book to book is by first quoting this passage from Truth Vibrations. He says, quote, "My own feeling and what I have channeled and seen leads me to believe that Jesus survived the crucifixion. I had a very strong vision of Jesus on the cross. During that vision, I was with Jesus, experiencing what he felt. He experienced great pain in his hands and wrists, and he was utterly exhausted. I then saw a pole being raised with a cloth, which was offered to his mouth. From this he took a drink. Soon after this he appeared to lose consciousness. When he awoke, he was lying with people all around him, attending to his wounds. They were all in white, I remember. It was clear that Jesus was in a state of shock. He whispered, 'I live, I live,' as though he had expected to leave the physical body. I had other visions and channeling, which together gave me this overall picture of what actually happened 2,000 years ago." Now listen to his version of the crucifixion in his next book, Love Changes Everything. When the channeling, crucifixion, had finished, one of the followers asked if Jesus could be taken down, and his request was granted. He was still alive at this point, but the swift movement of the sword removed him from the physical level. Only Jesus knew for certain he would die. So, in this version, Jesus did die, which is obviously a massive contradiction from the previous book with no explanation of the discrepancy. Keep in mind, in that book, Jesus personally talks to David on a regular basis. For instance, Jesus is quoted as saying things like, quote, "I was so determined, David, so determined to ensure that the truth could not disappear because one man was nailed to some wood, and I knew the effect it would have on Lucifer Satan if the energies were powerful enough." Icke always tries to downplay his famous claim to be the Son of God. He always said he was simply claiming to be a Son of God, not the Son of God. But the problem is that he really did claim that he personally was the one spoken of in the Bible that was going to return. He claims in this clip to be the second coming of Christ.
Do you think if Jesus were alive today and you'd been alive then, he would be writing books and doing promo tours and appearing on television programs and so forth? Would he be promoting it in the same way that you are now?
Tell you the funny thing, Nicky, you know, the Bible actually predicts the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the Son of God, at this time of great change.
Oh, right now?
Yeah. Well, at this time of great change.
The Bible predicts you in a way?
Yeah, exactly. It calls the being the Son of Man.
Where is that? So people.
That is in the book of Revelations towards the end.
Right.
And it's also earlier on in some of the Gospels too. What do they expect this Son of Man to look like? Do they expect him to wear a beard and a white robe?
Well, they don't expect him to be a Hereford United goalkeeper.
Correct. But did they expect, the people 2,000 years ago didn't expect their Son of God or whatever to be a carpenter's son, and he got the same reaction. You see, what it is, it's about incarnating into a body that relates to the world as it is at the time. That's why Jesus was a carpenter's son and worked in Palestine. Why in this life have I...
You were a broadcaster.
Exactly. Why was I taken into the communications?
You were taught self-discipline in sport.
Correct.
I know that.
This is how it's done.
Yeah.
And so I'm comfortable talking to you, and I'm comfortable on television, I'm comfortable in broadcasting, which is a great help to get over the truth, as the world is at the moment, where the media is the vehicle to do it. You are given the gifts, and we're all given the gifts, that we need in particular lifetimes, and at this time, in this lifetime, I need certain abilities to be comfortable on the media and know the media, and that's what's been given to me.
And as most of you know, Icke's view on Jesus changes dramatically from here. He would later add elements from various books that he read, and by the time he gets to The Biggest Secret, he exchanged all previous views for Brian Desborough's view. Have you ever heard of Icke talk about Tammuz and Nimrod and Queen Semiramis? I'm pretty sure you have. It's one of the most common parts of Icke's presentations, and he rarely misses an opportunity to launch into his spiel.
In Babylon, they had a trinity of Queen Semiramis, also known as Ishtar or Istar, Nimrod, the sun god, she was the moon goddess, and Tammuz, who was the virgin-born son of Nimrod and Semiramis.
He took this view word for word from Brian Desborough, and although he doesn't credit Desborough for it, it's clear that he did. For instance, there is no mention of Tammuz or Semiramis before this book, and it's obvious that he is using the same wording from Desborough's article called The Great Pyramid Mystery, Tomb, Occult Initiation Center, or What. For instance, Icke writes, Tammuz, who is said to have been crucified with a lamb at his feet and placed in a cave when a rock was rolled away from the cave's entrance 3 days later. Now compare that with what Desborough writes. Tammuz, who according to the writer Langton Tius, was said to have been crucified with a lamb at his feet and placed in a cave when a rock was rolled away from the cave's entrance 3 days later. The only difference is that Icke takes out the reference to Langton Tius. One reason he probably did this is because Langton Tius was a person who was widely known for taking Christianity and trying to explain it using pagan symbology to be more acceptable to the pagans. So it's not shocking if we were to find this information, but as we will see, even given this, the claim is still not true, and that's probably why Icke drops the reference altogether. In any case, the point is that Icke took the reference, and it's clear that Icke had access to this particular article, because in other places in his book, The Biggest Secret, when Icke cites Desborough, he cites this very same article. The footnote reads, Brian Desborough, The Great Pyramid Mystery, Tomb, Occult Initiation Center, or What? A document supplied to the author and also published in the California Sun newspaper, Los Angeles. The biggest problem here is not who he got the information from, but how terrible the information is. No scholar would ever write that a rock was rolled away from Tammuz's tomb after 3 days. This is a flat-out untruth with no apologies. Even Acharya S., who Desborough is misquoting right here, disagrees with this idea, and that's saying something if you know who she is. Icke traded in his earlier view of Jesus for this most easily disproved one. I will call it the zeitgeist version of Jesus. This is the one where he did not exist in history, but was an amalgamation of ancient pagan gods. This is the one that I believed for a long time, thanks to David Icke. But I started doing some investigation on my own, and I realized that something was really wrong with this view. Although it sounded plausible and even scientific, I couldn't confirm any of it with the actual writings about these gods from the original sources. And all the people that claimed that these things could be found in the original sources were Freemasons or Luciferians. For instance, Icke tells us in The Biggest Secret that Horus was the Good Shepherd, that Horus was the Lamb. Horus was baptized at age 30, he was the child of a virgin, his birth was marked by a star, he had 12 followers, Horus was the morning star, Horus was the cursed, Horus was tempted on a mountain by Set, and that he was a child teacher in a temple. The problem is that none of this is true. If you read every single thing you can find that the Egyptians wrote about Horus, you won't find any of this stuff. It's a flat-out lie. And guess who Icke cites for his claims like this? Albert Churchward, a high-level Freemason. And not only that, but someone who lacks any expertise in this field. I think one reviewer of his book on Amazon said it best about Albert Churchward in regard to his scholarship, quote, "This book is not recommended for those expecting a scientific approach. The absence of any description of the author's academic background explains it all." I've had a website up called ZeitgeistChallenge.com since the film Zeitgeist came out, and it offers $1,000 cash to anyone who can simply show where in the ancient texts these things can be found. I've yet to have one serious submission to this challenge since the website was put up. I have had a lot of people confident that they could answer the challenge until they started to look for the actual writings themselves, which is why I put the site up in the first place, to get people to come to the same conclusions that I did on my own. This is a Freemasonic lie. Yes, I know that the movie gives a long list of their sources, but if you inspect those sources, you will find that they do not even attempt to cite actual original texts, but instead cite recent authors who themselves do not cite sources. If this idea that I'm suggesting makes you mad and you think that I'm kidding, please watch the films Zeitgeist Refuted, Final Cut, or Zeitgeist Part 1 Exposed, the film. In the footnotes you'll find both of them, and they're both by two separate filmmakers, and they do a great job of showing how easily this idea is refuted. In fact, of all the various versions of Jesus that Icke has had, this current view is the most easily refuted. Now let's go back to Desbro and Icke's view about all the Babylonian symbolism in Christianity. But first let me explain something that will really help you understand what we're about to discuss. Christianity was around for at least 300 years before the Vatican existed. Secular history records a massive slaughter that literally lasted the entire early history of Christianity. Almost every emperor of Rome, starting with Nero, continued the relentless genocide of Christians. They fed them to the lions in arenas, and they burnt them alive for fun. This is what being a Christian was for the first 300 years of their history. Deciding to be a Christian was basically deciding to be tortured and killed publicly. It wasn't a decision that people made lightly. These people's beliefs were nothing like the Babylonian religion of Rome. This is one reason why Rome hated them so much. A good example of this is the Emperor Diocletian, who believed he had eliminated all the Christians. He erected monuments to himself that boasted of this supposed accomplishment. It was engraved, Diocletian, Jovian, Maximin, Herculeus, Caesarus, Augusti, for having everywhere abolished the superstition of Christ, for having extended the worship of the gods. It was only after one of the emperors, Constantine, was said to convert to Christianity, and the jury is still out as to whether that actually happened or not, but one thing is certain: after that time the government decided to stop fighting Christianity, and instead it seeked to totally control it. It unwisely declared Christianity the official religion of Rome, which, as you can imagine, was a shock to all the pagan citizens of Rome. This is when you start to see all the pagan symbolism start to creep into Christianity. It was added, at least in part, to appease the pagans and incorporate their symbolism into a religion that they had all tried to destroy for the last 300 years. And this is the key to understanding this. The Bible itself, the writings that the Christians were reading during their times of persecution, doesn't support any of these Illuminati symbols or ideas. This is why the Vatican made reading the Bible illegal in the 1200s. The real Christians were literally burned alive with their illegal copies of the Bible chained around their necks. Even to this day, the Catholics do not recommend reading the Bible themselves. They say it's better left to the priests to interpret for them. This is also why it was not allowed to be translated into any language but Latin for 1,000 years. The obvious reason is that if the people were allowed to read the Bible, they would know that the empire was telling them to do and believe things that were not in the Bible. Take the second commandment, for instance.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them.
Now this should help you see what's going on when David shows this picture of Mary and the Queen of Heaven. Yeah, sure, there's an ancient goddess called the Queen of Heaven, and the Roman Catholics do call Mary the Queen of Heaven. But has anyone ever read to you what the Bible says about this Queen of Heaven? In the book of Judges, 1 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and Jeremiah, it talks about this pagan sacrifice and mentions specifically the pagan goddess called the Queen of Heaven several times. And God declares, because of their worship of this pagan goddess called the Queen of Heaven, that he would withdraw his protection from them and judge them. The fact that the Roman government took the story of Mary and inserted their favorite goddess, the same one that the Bible actually warns us about, does not mean that Christianity was based on the Queen of Heaven. It just means that the government was tricking people into doing what they wanted them to do. And as generations went by, with people no longer reading the Bible anymore, it got easier and easier to trick people in regard to what was and what wasn't actually in the Bible.
So this is why there is the Babylonian depiction of Semiramis and Tammuz, and this is a Christian church. Same again. This is a picture I took last Christmas in Rome when I was there for a television program, and that appears to be Jesus and Mary. Actually, it's Semiramis and Tammuz.
I don't even think that I understood this one when I did believe that Icke was genuine. Has anyone ever stopped to consider that mothers with children might be the most common motif in art in the history of the world? I mean, mothers have always had children since the dawn of time, right? Even before there were fruit bowls to paint, there were no shortage of mothers with children. I think it's kind of funny when I hear people showing a picture of a mother and a child statue, as if they're making a deep connection to Christianity. If statues of mothers with children is a specific thing, only to be compared with Mary and Jesus, then I have a lot more similarities with Mary and Jesus that I would like to add to the list, from every culture and every time period. Again, you won't find any descriptions of Mary holding Jesus at all in the Bible. It's not some special idea in the Bible at all. This is art commissioned by the Roman government, and it has nothing to do with Christianity. Early Christians did not make images of Jesus because of what they thought was obedience to the second commandment about making idols. This artwork is only something you see after Rome starts calling the shots and telling everyone this is what Christianity is now. And the sad thing is, nowadays we believe them. This also explains this idea of halos. So much is made about these halos in theosophy and in the occult, but there's nothing about halos in the Bible. Early Christians wouldn't even make paintings of Jesus in the first place, as we mentioned. The halos on Jesus or other people that Rome made the artists paint is only evidence that as pagans, the Roman/Babylonians were trying to appeal to the pagans who were used to seeing their gods like this. The whole idea is foreign to real Christianity and foreign to the Bible. Just another case of Icke telling you to believe that the Illuminati version of Christianity is the real version. But my favorite one that Icke uses is this one.
This is another depiction of Nimrod in the ancient world. He was also the fish god. Again, Jesus, the fish. He had the fish head hat. This is a depiction, actual depiction from Babylon, and that's why we have the mitre in the Pope.
The key to this one is the connection that Icke makes to Jesus and fish. Did you catch it?
Again, Jesus, the fish.
Jesus is in no way associated with fish, except in the occult world, where Blavatsky stated this because she wanted to connect Jesus to the age of Pisces, so that she could be done with him in her new age. When Jordan Maxwell does this, he always will say, Jesus the Fisher King, which is not a title for Jesus at all. Jesus wasn't a fisher king or a fisherman. Jesus was a carpenter. This is a little mind trick that Maxwell plays to build up the case that Jesus was associated with Pisces. There are about 3 things that people say to equate Jesus with fish so they can either make this Dagon hat connection or the Pisces connection. Let's look at them really quick so we can see why Icke's, quote, Jesus the fish thing is so wrong. A few of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. Now, does that make Jesus a fish? He did feed many people one time with 2 fish. And this is why people equate him with the astrological sign of Pisces, which is represented by 2 fish. But when people make this claim, they never mention that only a few days later, he did the same thing with more than 2 fish and a different number of loaves. Why wouldn't they tell you about that instance a few pages later? Because it ruins the whole Pisces thing. The fact is that Jesus did all kinds of miracles. We don't associate Jesus with ears, even though he was said to heal a man's ear once. And the final thing that people do is point to the Jesus fish on cars. This symbol was representative of an acrostic in the Greek language that early Christians used to use as a sign to see if certain places were safe for them during the persecutions. It meant Jesus, anointed, God, Son, and Savior, and it doesn't make Jesus a fish. Before moving on to another man who Icke bases his beliefs on, I will conclude that the reason that the emperors of Rome and later the Roman Catholic Church tried to keep the Bible from people is that contrary to what we are taught in the so-called truth movement, the Bible is incredibly anti-Illuminati. Not only does God reveal to people like Ezekiel that the elites of his day, the Illuminati if you will, were worshiping the sun behind closed doors, and later he showed him that the secret worship of Tammuz was going on too. It is filled with discussions and promises to judge this so-called secret power of lawlessness, which we might call the Illuminati. See my video, Was the Bible Written or Changed by the Illuminati, for more on this. Another of Icke's sources is a man named Michael Talbot. He wrote the book The Holographic Universe, and Icke quotes him frequently as the basis for his belief that nothing is real and everything is a hologram. Talbot spends the first few chapters of his book doing an excellent job of describing a well-known theory of Karl Pribram and David Bohm called the holonomic brain theory. In their experiment, they cut out different parts of rats' brains and ran them through mazes and discovered that memories were apparently stored in each sector of the brain, which is similar to a hologram in that each piece of the hologram contains some information about the entire image. Both Bohm and Pribram would later speculate about applying what they found in the brain to the entire universe, but it would remain just a theory. The rest of Talbot's book simply starts naming paranormal phenomenon and declaring that it exists because the universe is a hologram. He rarely if ever cites his evidence, and when he does, he reveals his lack of discernment. Consider his support of Sai Baba. Talbot spends several pages gushing over Baba as a perfect example that the universe is a hologram because Baba, according to Talbot, performs these miracles. But watch this video of Baba performing what can only be described as cheap sleight of hand tricks as I read from the Holographic Universe. Perhaps the most famous modern-day materializations are those produced by Sai Baba, a 64-year-old Indian holy man living in a distant corner of the state of Andhra Pradesh in southern India. According to numerous eyewitnesses, Sai Baba is able to produce much more than salt and a few stones. He plucks lockets, rings, and jewelry out of the air and passes them out as gifts. He also materializes an endless supply of Indian delicacies and sweets, and out of his hands pours volumes of vibhuti, or sacred ash. These events have been witnessed by literally thousands of individuals, including both scientists and magicians, and no one has ever detected any hint of trickery. He can make sweet syrups and fragrant oils pour from his hands. He can produce exotic objects, such as grains of rice with tiny, perfectly carved pictures of Krishna on them. Equally astonishing are his productions of sacred ash. Every time he walks among the crowds that visit him, prodigious amounts of it pour from his hands. He scatters it everywhere, into offered containers and outstretched hands, over heads and in long serpentine trails on the ground. If Sai Baba had produced them by sleight of hand, it was undetectable to us. Talbot also talks about cases of stigmata. This is when people get wounds in their hands and feet that are supposed to be similar to those of Christ. These cases are dubious at best, especially because the wounds usually happen when no one is looking. But this doesn't stop Talbot from simply declaring them all to be genuine and evidence that the universe is a hologram. Or take some of the cases that Icke is fond of referring to. I'm sure you've all heard of the hypnotist that made the man see through his daughter. Everyone seems to love that one.
Like that wonderful story told by Michael Talbot in The Holographic Universe.
Yeah.
And I read that page over and over again when I first saw that book in the late 1980s. This is the story about the stage hypnotist who hypnotized the father to believe that his father was that his daughter was invisible. Mm-hmm. And then he was able to read an inscription on the watch held behind her body, because for him it was no longer there and reality had changed. It was physically different in his mind.
Like you write about in your book, about the fellow who's the hypnotist told the man, your daughter is not in the room with us any longer, and he looked right through the daughter to the man's watch.
He tells a story in here which is so brilliant. That's why I do tell it quite often, because it's so symbolic of what I'm talking about. He attended a party which his father had, and he had a stage hypnotist along to do party tricks for the guests. There came a point where the hypnotist is dealing with this guy called Tom, And he said to him, he's doing through the tricks, and then he said to him, when I bring you back to a waking state, you're not going to be able to see your daughter in the room. At which point the hypnotist led the daughter to stand right in front of the father who's looking in her belly. He brings him out of a to a waking state, or apparently so, and he says, Tom, can you see your daughter? Tom's looking around. No, I can't see her. She's giggling. He can't hear her. The hypnotist went behind the daughter, put his hand in the small of her back and said, I'm holding something, Tom. What am I holding? He looked bemused because it was so obvious to him. He said, you're holding a watch. He says, there's an inscription on the watch, Tom. Can you read it? He peered forward, read the inscription. His daughter standing between him and the watch.
The problem is that Talbot simply says this happened at his own father's friend's house. There's no citation whatsoever. We are asked to simply trust him that this happened. Let me ask you, if this was so easy that all a good hypnotist had to do was to tell someone that their daughter wasn't there, how come it hasn't been reproduced in a lab or some other place where this could be verified with a measure of proof? I mean, was this particular hypnotist the only guy in the world that could do this? Why not have someone simply put the idea to the test and prove it? I hope you see that the answer to that question is obvious. Talbot had preconceived notions himself. He describes how he grew up in a haunted house, and these ghosts would mess with him and his family. He describes involuntary out-of-body experiences and a host of other experiences involving what he calls poltergeists. He was on a mission to validate his experiences, even by his own admission. Here are some reviews of his book that I think sum this up well. I was profoundly disappointed by the book. I was expecting something that took an analytical view of an intriguing theory and explored its implications. Instead, what Talbot provided was a general overview of holography, some broad statements about its implications, and then tons of anecdotes about psychic phenomena that he claims are explained by everything being a hologram. Sadly, that's not science, nor is it compelling writing. Another reviewer says, the book is completely disingenuous and uses numerous case studies where the evidence is presented in a dishonest way. A simple Google search will turn up enough information on many of the book's claims to start to raise doubt. Further investigation will make you very upset that the evidence is presented so matter-of-factly, with no mention of the numerous controversies surrounding the evidence. This would be funny if it weren't obvious that Icke has based much of what he believes on this idea of the holographic universe.